You're listening to the Happier Marriage Podcast, which is a podcast for hopeful spouses, and this is episode number 12. On this episode, we'll be discussing setting healthy boundaries for a happier marriage without making it a control issue. As you can tell, we're in for a very spicy and dicey episode, and we want to get into that in a few moments. Now, as you listen to this episode, as I mentioned, it'll be spicy and dicey. I want you to look at it from a perspective of where you're coming from. What boundaries have you set, or are you setting, or are you expecting in your relationship? And how have you communicated those boundaries? Have you and your spouse actually mutually agreed upon them, or are they just expected, right? So it's a hoped for, a wish kind of boundary. Well, how is that working out so far? And we'll talk more about that in a few moments. Now, make sure that as you listen to this episode, that you also reflect upon the past episodes that I might mention in the show and listen to those as well. Subscribe to the show. That's very important. Leave a rating and a review, a 5-star rating and a very wonderful review for this podcast. Bookmark this podcast as your top resource for insights on having a happier marriage, and stay tuned as we unpack this episode. Hi, I'm Kingsley Grant, a licensed marriage and family therapist, certified relationship coach, and an in-demand speaker who have been married for over 3 decades with 2 adult children. I'm also the founder and CEO of Helping Families Improve, a counseling center that caters to helping families experience the life God intended for them to have. So how do we have a happier marriage where love, respect, and deep connection takes place? That's what you'll find out as you listen to the Happier Marriage Podcast. What's up, ladies and gentlemen of Happier Marriage World? I hope you're ready for another round of the Happier Marriage Podcast for hopeful spouses. This episode, like others, might trigger you because it hits close to home, but that is one of the purpose of this show, to stir things up and then to take you in for a safe landing. So buckle up and here we go. Happier marriages require setting healthy boundaries. Now, when someone hear the word or the phrase boundaries or the word boundaries, immediately some people think of, restriction. I don't want to be restricted. And so they shy away from setting boundaries or even expecting a boundary in their relationship. Some couples do not even know how to set healthy boundaries. They've never been exposed to that. They grew up where there was pretty much no boundaries, especially if they had a very permissive kind of parenting approach where it's almost hands off, right? There's no boundaries, no structure. And so they grew up with that kind of setting, and now they're married and they're wondering, why is it that we are having this conflict and this disagreement? Because we are running into each other and we're somehow creating scenarios in our relationship where finding ourselves at odds, right? But let me give you the definition of the word boundaries as we start to make sense of where we're going in this episode. Based upon the dictionary, the definition it gives is this: a line that marks the limits of an area. A line that marks the limits of an area, a dividing line. Now, as a person who is a sports person, that I grew up playing soccer. I'm not sure what sport you played, but any other sport is really secondary in my book. Soccer is the sport that is a universal sport. Every country that I've been into, and I've not been into a whole lot of countries, but quite a few, have soccer somehow, right? So let's just not have a debate And I don't want to get down into that, get off track here in defending the sport of all times. Anyway, soccer. But playing soccer, one of the things that we had to know is where the boundaries are. Where were it that if the ball went across a certain line, right, that was out of bounds. The referee who was there would blow the whistle because that, or the flag, the guy on the line who has a flag, he could also blow a whistle and raise a flag because the ball went across that line and is out of bounds, right? Imagine playing any sport, any team sport, that there were no boundaries. Imagine what that would be like. It would be chaotic. It would be chaotic. Every team sport requires some boundaries to let the people know who are playing that they can play as much as they want to within certain parameters set up, right? These lines that are drawn that helps them to have a great game. And also there are also other rules that are at play within soccer, right? There's a whole bunch of rules, and we're not going to get into soccer rules here because that's not the point. But I want you to remember this, that every team sport requires boundaries. Now, you might say, when I hear the word boundaries, it's restrictive in nature. Yes, it is. A part of it is, let's say it's not completely, but it has to have some restriction in whatever team sports, or if in marriage, there are restrictions. Now, this is where it kind of gets somehow hairy and dicey here because it's relative, right? Because every marriage should decide what their boundaries should look like. It's not like, say, soccer, where the rules of the game is applicable in every place it's played. And that's where this illustration breaks down, because it's not true in marriage. Every single marriage have and must decide what boundaries they want to engage in, right? Because some marriages are just going to be different, right? Different people, two different people, different backgrounds. They have to decide. But whichever, for a marriage to be happier, or to have a happier marriage, you've got to have boundaries. Now, when you did get married, you initially decided that you made some vows to one another. That was boundaries you were setting up at the very get-go. Those were restrictive in nature because it says, I'm going to make you the only person, right? I've chosen you to be my husband or my wife. And so I'm simply saying it's you and me and no other. It's complete, right? There's no other third person, fourth person. It's complete. We've made an agreement. That's what vows are for. Vows begin boundaries set in. And you agreed to that. If you didn't want to have boundaries, why got married, right? You shouldn't have gotten married, because just to have gotten married is simply saying that you have set a boundary already, right? Now, sometimes people may say boundaries and they think, oh man, it's like to keep me away from being my best self, or to have this or to have that. No, boundaries, the real goal of boundaries when they're healthy is truly to create intimacy, is to tell the other person that here's how I can move towards you and feel safe and without concern. And here's how you can move towards me and create intimacy, and we can feel safe and without much concern, right? Because when you don't have these, there's going to be a lot of concerns and possibly unsafe interactions. And I'll share with you some examples in a few minutes of what that may look like. But the whole goal of healthy boundaries is for intimacy, to create a space where, again, going back to the soccer, the boundaries where is in place so we can have a good game, a very structured game, and we can have hopefully some fun playing, right? That's what the whole idea of boundaries and rules are set up for. Now, yes, if it's violated, there are consequences of that, and that's understandable. And so it's in marriage. You want there to be some kind of agreed upon way of, I call it rules of engagement, so that you can operate and feel like you're safe and not have to worry about it. But if there's violation of those boundaries, then there's got to be consequences, and we'll talk more about that in a few moments. Now, again, there are many books written on boundaries. One of the ones that I recommend very much, very highly, the book, and there's a new updated version, I think it is, that's available, and I have I do mostly audiobooks, right? And so if you are an audiobook person, then, hopefully you, like myself, can go through them pretty quickly. But one of the books that I really recommend strongly is the Boundaries by Dr. Henry Cloud. Henry Cloud, Cloud. I recommend his books. They're very well written, and they are really, I believe, well balanced, right? And it has a spiritual component, which I really like as well, because as you know, this podcast is both scientific and Christian based, which is a spiritual component as well. So I recommend highly Dr. Henry Cloud's work on boundaries. So can never exhaust this topic, but I want you to know, if you want to know more, I recommend getting his books on boundaries, right? So having said that, you will find about consequences that must be in place, right? Because again, going back to your vows, if you violate those vows, then obviously there's some consequences that should be in place. Whatever those consequences might be, they are really set from relationship to relationship, marriage to marriage, and it's not one size that fits all. But what I'm giving you is some principles that need to be considered or should be considered if you're going to have a happier marriage. But here's a concern sometimes when I find in people setting boundaries, it could be set in a way to be weaponized, where it's a control issue. They want to control the relationship, and they're going to tell the spouse what boundaries they want not to be crossed, right? And sometimes it's to somehow operate almost as if they're a single person. They don't want any question to be asked. They want to come and go as they please. And they're trying to tell the spouse, hey, don't cross this boundary. Don't ask me any questions. I'm at work. When I come home, I don't want to be bothered. That's a boundary setting kind of statement, but that could be very questionable or suspect in nature, because you are in a marriage. You should have the chance to ask questions and share. If I suggest many times, communicate to your spouse. Let them know what's going on. Update them. If you're going to be working late, let them know. And somehow it should not be a regular, it should be exceptions, not the rule, where that's going to be the way you are operating, right? So boundaries are very, very important. And that's why I've talked about, you've heard me in this podcast talk about empathic communication as the singular most effective communication skill to use in kind of conversations like these. Why? Because it allows you to empathically enter the space and have conversation mutually, right? It's not that you want to kind of drive home a point and control your spouse. That's not what it is for. It is to come up with what might be most helpful for the relationship. So here's some examples of boundary setting that I have listed 5, and I won't get in depth, but just to give you examples of where boundaries might be set. For example, one I've heard so often is in the in-laws involvement, right? What is appropriate and what's inappropriate? And again, as a couple, you have to decide. You have to sit down and talk about these things, have conversation, and agree upon what is acceptable and what is not acceptable, right? For example, in-laws might want to impose parenting skills and tell you how to run your house, how to cook your meals, how to feed your children, how to discipline your children. Now, you want to set some boundaries around that, whatever that may look like for you. I'm not going to say, sit here and tell you what's best for you. You've got to decide it. And sometimes you might need to sit down with a counselor to help you come up with helpful boundaries that are not designed to punish your in-laws, right? Because you may have a beef with one of your in-laws and want to punish them. That's not the reason for boundaries. Now, if they are interfering in the relationship and you both see where that interference is causing a problem, then you want to set boundaries around that. Okay. Secondly, outside friendships, professional and personal. Now, this is a very tricky one, right? Because sometimes you have relationships that are very long-standing. A good friend who may be an opposite sex friend and is very platonic. It's not like you guys have engaged emotionally or any otherwise, but that person have been there for a long-standing relationship and is very, very comfortable with your spouse, right? Your husband and your wife, and is known to the relationship. How do you manage that? Right? And so again, you may want to have the conversation because some boundaries have to be in place now that you're married. It just can't be as it was when you were not married. And that person, if they are respectful of their relationship, will understand that. But boundaries must be set around outside friendships, right? Whether it's professional or personal. Again, it's not about controlling. It may seem to have that tone, but if you understand that the relationship, the marriage is number one, it has to take priority, then everything else have to come second, have to fall in second and third place, but it cannot be in the dominant space of the marriage. All right. Number 3, the freedom to express sexual boundaries. So sexual boundaries are very important because there are some things that one spouse may want to do and the other spouse is not comfortable with. And they should have a right to express what boundaries they want to have in their relationship when it comes to sexual intimacy, sexual intercourse. And it has to be respected. Now, again, there could be movement on either side, right? There could be a compromise of some regards. But again, it should not be imposed. It should not be forced, should not be coerced. It should be respected. And setting sexual boundaries are very important because it allows you to maintain certain personal or individual choice, empowerment, and not feel as if you are going to be treated as a sexual object. And to avoid that, then there's got to be some boundaries in place, right? And both of you have to, of course, decide what it should look like. Because one person may have certain preferences, the others may not, but it's where empathic communication helps you to have this kind of conversation, right? And I love what the Bible says, that the marriage bed is undefiled, meaning that you can have whatever sexual intercourse or sexual positions and interactions you want to have, as long as it's not something that's forced upon the other person and is not and must be mutually agreed upon. It has to be mutually agreed upon, and not one person want to force a behavior on the other person and somehow think that this person, hey, you're my wife, you're my husband, you should. No. Boundaries are what would regulate that. And again, I could go on, but I hope you're getting the idea here. What about the area of spiritual boundaries, right? Because sometimes people can use the Bible. Example, I've seen and heard this so many times, where a person feels as if they are being hammered by the Bible, especially if one spouse is more spiritual. He or she may want to use that to cower their spouse into submission, right? Especially that word, right? Ooh, submission word. And so it can cause a problem. And so you got to have spiritual boundaries, meaning, what does it look like? Do you then use your scripture to constantly browbeat your spouse into doing certain things that you want them to do? Do you, in your prayers, if you're praying together, use that as an opportunity to kind of beat up on your spouse in prayer, and now because you're in prayer, you feel like that's a right? So spiritual boundaries could be, for example, the frequency of attending church and what that should look like, right? And again, it could look, every relationship is going to look different, but here's a key word: mutually agreed upon, mutually communicated, right? It's communicated where you've agreed upon and have a dialogue and say what that should look like, right? And the last one that I have here on the list, right? So far we've spoken about then the in-laws, as I talk about these examples, right, of boundaries. We talk about in-law involvement. We talk about friendship, both professional and personal. We've talked about sexual boundaries and how to express that. We've spoken about spiritual boundaries. And I hope I did enough on the spiritual boundaries, because I had to be able to respect that different people have different religious beliefs. And so I don't want to impose on any, but within the confines or the context of your beliefs, what are the boundaries that need to be abide by, right? So, for example, I'll give a quick example here from a Christian perspective. When it comes to spiritual boundaries, I believe that for my wife and myself, that the Bible becomes our point of reference. So we're going to use that to define what our spiritual boundaries should be when it comes to prayer, when it comes to church attendance, when it comes to generosity and charitable charitable activities, and what are the boundaries there when it comes to taking care of the poor and the needy. We have to have some spiritual boundaries so we don't exceed certain things and set up an issue in our family dynamic. So we have to decide based on your spiritual reference point. That's what you have to use to determine your spiritual boundaries, right? So I don't want to have a one size fits all here, and I hope you understand where I'm coming from there. So the last one here is your physical needs, right? So maybe you are a person that is more physical things, right? You are a person that is probably into fitness, right? Working out, exercising, and your spouse may not be. Well, what do you do at those moments? Well, you have to be able to decide for yourself, because we are all responsible for ourselves no matter what. For example, there was a time that for me, playing soccer, growing up in the sports world, I wanted to keep it in shape is very important to me. Now, have I always done that? No. There was a long time where I played no soccer. I didn't exercise as I should. And I just know there was something off, right? But I kind of, toyed with the idea here and there. I would exercise now and not, and, you go back and forth and all of that, seasons of my life as well. But anyway, I was more the physical type than my wife was. She really was on and off when it comes to exercising, but I know what I needed. So I got back into that working out and have made that a part of my life for many years now. And she has also kind of gotten into it, not because I kind of embarrassed her or shamed her or into any of those, because again, I have to then be able to set boundaries, and she had to set boundaries around the things I can, how do I approach this, right? And in this way, it was more of implicit, meaning that it was not explicitly stated, but by implicit kind of understanding, where I had to use, again, empathic communication. I had to also be sensitive to certain things, and she likewise. But we had to then decide about what boundaries do we need in our physical needs. So for me, again, I needed to have space for exercising, to go to the gym or to go running. And so I had to decide where I need some time, me time, right? But I then have to communicate that with her, so it did not somehow compete with other times where family times, right? So it's a boundary we had to set up where I know my need, she knows hers, and we had to go for it. And I don't think I did a great job in explaining the physical boundary aspect of things, but I hope it's enough to realize that you both have different physical needs, and then you have to attend to that, but you need to set boundaries around what that looks like, right? Because it may be where, you might be saying, hey, yeah, I know you don't work out, so I need to go and get somebody of the opposite sex to work out with on a regular basis. Some boundaries need to be set there, right? So you get what I'm talking about in that regards. So anyway, these 5 examples, I hope it reinforced for you the whole idea of boundary settings, right? And that is the extent of when it comes to the in-law involvement, professional and personal friendship relationships outside of the marriage, sexual boundaries, spiritual boundaries, and physical needs boundaries. These are just examples. They're not an exhaustive list. But as I said earlier, I highly recommend Dr. Henry Cloud's book on boundary setting, because you'll find more examples. You'll find him explaining in his book much, much better than I have, because, of course, he's the author of that book that I have pulled some ideas from as well. So I hope this was helpful and at least begin the boundary setting conversation that you need to have, you want to have with your spouse, and make certain that you dialogue around this, right? Make sure you just don't kind of decide on yourself what it should look like and then impose that upon the relationship. It should be something that you both discuss and you both agree upon, and you both come to some kind of negotiable outcome or agreed upon outcome where both of you are satisfied with whatever you come up with, right? And so it may take like I said earlier, it may take somebody outside to help you to negotiate these boundary settings. And if so, get a third party to help you to negotiate some of these ones that might be more tricky than the other. Okay, so I hope this was helpful, my friend, and let me encourage you to, as we're wrapping things up, my prayer is that God would give you his grace, his wisdom to negotiate this boundary setting requirement of your marriage to experience a happier marriage. Okay, so let me invite you to be a part of an upcoming webinar that I have on September 22nd. And if you're listening to this podcast episode before the 22nd, you can still sign up, right? Because it's on the 22nd at 9 p.m. Eastern. It's 5 secrets to reviving your marriage that no one hardly ever talks about. That's the title of the webinar. 5 is Happier Marriage Revival. 5 secrets to reviving your marriage that no one hardly ever talks about. And if you go to kingsleygrant.com/webinar, okay, kingsleygrant.com/webinar, you'll be able to be taken right to the page to register for it. And if you missed the webinar, no worries, you'll get the replay and you can always listen to that. But it's only timed, the replay will be up for a few days and that's it. So again, it's kingsleygrant.com/webinar, and there's a 5 secrets to reviving your marriage that no one hardly ever talks about. Okay, so I look forward to seeing you there on the webinar. My friend, thank you for being a part of this episode. Remember to subscribe to the show, leave a rating and a review on the platform in which you're listening, preferably Apple Podcasts or Google Podcasts. Leave a rating and a review there. I would really appreciate that. So thank you so much for being here, listening to the show. With that said, peace out, God bless, and I'll see you on the next episode.